lecture or kind of discussion. I'm going to give my public service announcement. I've been teaching quite a while now. I've taught this class a long time now. I find that after spring break, a lot of students start to check out. It's probably not anybody on this call, but again, I do have this recorded, so I'm going to give it to everyone. That this is the time where students a lot of times mess up their semester. I said I have lots of students who do pretty well into spring break. Spring break comes, they take that 1 week break, and they never come back. In this class, if you've never come back from spring break, it's going to be a long semester. I apologize for that, but that's kind of how it's going to operate. This is one of the tougher modules, well, because it's built on the other two. So we're going to use module 1 and module 2, and now we're going to kind of give this culmination of the materials. We're going to put everything together to try to describe how the economy works. Right now, we're kind of doing just bits and pieces. Like if you look at module 2, we took production, we talked about that. We talked about prices, we talked about employment. What we're going to do in this last module is we're going to combine all of those things that we talked about in module 2. And we're going to make module 3, and we're going to really describe how the economy works. A lot of times, sometimes students get overwhelmed. And when you do, go back and remember what we discussed in module 2 and take those principles moving forward. We're not changing the ideas, we're just now applying them. So make sure, a lot of times students struggle with definitions. You don't necessarily, it's the vocabulary that gets you. Is you might understand what the word means, but when you see the word again and used in context, it becomes difficult. That's why reading the textbook helps. My daughter has the same problem. She kind of she understands material, but sometimes she forgets to read the textbook, so the words feel foreign to her. So when she sees them on the test, she goes, well, what does this mean? Well, you have to understand the words, reading them and understanding them in context. So that way, when you see them on the test, you have seen the words, you have seen them used that way before. A lot of times that's why students struggle on the test, is because you've seen the word, but you've not really utilized the word, so it seems foreign when you see it on the test. So please make sure you are reading chapters. That's why you're supposed to read the textbook. And go through and take notes. If you don't know what a word means, look it up. Kind of sounds like that's elementary school, but it still applies. I look words up as well today. But I didn't really know the word could be used like that. So please don't be afraid to look words up and ask about them. So that's kind of my public service announcements moving towards module 3. I don't really sometimes like to be too preachy, and I'm sorry about that. But that's just kind of trying to set you up. I don't want you to be surprised or your expectations. Sometimes I overspeak, as I try not to scare you too much, but I want to make sure that you understand that not putting in enough effort will doom you to fail. And I don't want anybody to do that. So I try to make sure that I put it out there so you understand. There's expectations. And this chapter I know is difficult and a lot of students struggle. But I also have a lot of students who do very well. And that's part of what I like to see. I like to see students progressing as the semester has gone along. Okay, some of those are my favorite students. I said I've had students who have failed the first test and did very well in test 3 when their classmates didn't do so well. And actually those are probably some of my more favorite students. And those are the ones I want to see, is they worked hard and they got better. And that's all I'm asking. So please continue to work through the semester and let us start chapter 17. So what chapter 17 is going to deal with is we're going to talk now about money. So chapter 16 kind of talked about what money is. Chapter 17 is we're going to talk about how money and inflation are related. And how do we use them? And how does the money growth lead to inflation? Okay, so we're going to spend a lot of time looking at the money supply. Why? It's very relevant in today's world. We see a lot of an increase in the money supply in today's world. What should we expect to happen to both inflation and interest rates? What happens to real variables in the real interest rate? Why is inflation like a tax? And what do I mean by a tax? And then finally, we're going to go through the cost of inflation, and we're going to try to talk about how serious they are and what economists see as the cost of inflation and why we worry about them. And it's not all the same worry that other people have that haven't quite understood on economics or don't study it. They have a different view of inflation, which is actually naive and not quite, I hate to say wrong, but it's not quite correct. We'll go with that. It's kind of a nicer way to say it. And we're going to talk about that fallacy in belief. So let's go over some quick definitions. The definition I will start with, there is a possibility of deflation. So now the word deflation means a decrease in the overall prices. So that means the price level decreased. So remember, we have CPI of 120, and if the CPI went down to 110 next year, that would be something we would call deflation. Is the price level actually dropped? So that's referred to as deflation. In the United States, it's quite rare. Rarely do we have deflation. We'll talk about an example at the end of this chapter on Wednesday about deflation. And we'll kind of bring in some, I guess it's not pop culture anymore, but we'll bring in some outside literature to discuss what happened in the US economy and why deflation is sometimes actually worse than inflation. And we'll talk about that. There's two periods in US history where it's relatively symbolic. We saw it in the 1880s to about 1896. There was actually a long period of deflation. We'll talk about why that is. We also saw it during the Great Depression. We saw prices down 25% on a yearly basis. In the pandemic, we only saw it for about 3 months. So we saw it from March, April, and May during the pandemic in the United States, and we actually saw prices fall in this 3 periods. We saw prices fall by 1.1%. So that's like a lot of deflation today. But for the most part, we haven't seen deflation in today's world. So we don't spend a whole lot of time talking about it, but we will talk about it a little bit because it does make the news when we start to approach that. So we will talk about that. What we are more likely to see in the US economy and in most economies is inflation, and that is an increase in the overall price level. We have seen substantial variation over time. Depending on when you look at US history, inflation is entirely different. So if we went from, say, when most of you have been alive, if you're a traditional college student, you've not seen high inflation. Inflation in your time period has averaged 1.5%. However, if we go back to the 70s, inflation during that time period was running about 7.8%, almost 8% a year. So different people have different experiences with inflation. In their adult life, in their childhood, in different areas, we have different experiences with inflation. If you're from different countries, you have different experiences with inflation. For the most part, over the last, from about World War II to today, US inflation has been right around 2.5%. The goal, according to the Federal Reserve, if you pay attention to them, is the number we shoot for in the United States is right around 2%. So that's the target goal for countries. It's not an explicit goal for the United States. We'll talk about that later. But it is kind of their rule of thumb. That's the number they shoot for. And so if you pay attention to the news and you pay attention to the Federal Reserve talking, That's kind of their goalpost, 2%. Recently, they've made a big deal that they're willing to go over 2% for a little bit. And again, this is going to have impacts on the market and the stock market, but that's what they're listening to. What is this inflation goal? We'll talk about what that means and how that applies. So just kind of, I told about different parts of the world see different inflation. Here's what it looks like throughout the world. So in the United States in 2018, we were at 2.4. In 2019, it was 2.3. In 2020, it was 1.3. Remember that if we took away those 3 months that were negative 1.1 and prices didn't change in those months, we would have been at 2.4. So the United States has been running a little bit over the 2% number. In 2021, as of right now, how they calculate the inflation rate is they go back for the last 12 months. So if we add up the inflation for the last 12 months, we get 1.7%. But remember, coming for the next 3 months, we have this negative 1.1. So if prices don't change for the next 3 months, we'll be running at 2.8% inflation in the United States. That'll be our annual rate in May if nothing changes. If prices remain exactly what they are today, the year-over-year change in inflation will be about 3%, which is well above what our goal is. Remember, our goal is 2. Fed chair said he'll allow it to go over 2, but how much over 2 is kind of in debate. So that's why there's discussion about it in the stock market. Other countries goes as such. The big one here is Venezuela. In 2018, it was running 1.4 million% a year. Or if you do it daily, prices were increasing 3% a day, 2.6 to be precise. This is what we call hyperinflation. The definition the book gives for hyperinflation is an extraordinary high rate of inflation. What do I mean by extraordinarily high? That's a good question, and we don't have a good answer for that. I like to try to draw from other parts of the world or other things. So when I describe hyperinflation, I like to use kind of a definition that a Supreme Court justice gave for another topic. He was discussing, or they were discussing, what was pornography. And the chief justice, or the justice at the time, said, I can't give you an exact definition of pornography, but I know it when I see it. As economists, we would kind of state the same thing about hyperinflation. We don't have a really good definition of what makes hyperinflation hyper. We just know it when we see it. So the examples we see is 1.4 million% per year. That's definite. We saw similar situations in Zimbabwe. Right? So Zimbabwe was running millions of percent a year in the 2000s as well. 2000s. In the U.S. history, we've seen very, very limited views of hyperinflation. The only time we saw hyperinflation was right around the 1780s. There was this period that we were worried about hyperinflation. Now, for you who are history majors, you can go back, and it's a discussion about Hamilton, the U.S. monetary system. So there's this discussion about how the U.S. should pay back war debt. And what do we do? And if we just print the money, that creates hyperinflation. Hyperinflation comes about because governments print money. We'll talk about why that occurs here in a second. So let's talk about inflation. Inflation is very simple. Prices rise when the government prints too much money. So we know prices will go up when the government prints too much money. So the money supply is increased. So when the money supply increases, that should lead to prices increasing. And how we're going to discuss that is we're going to use this theory called the quantity theory of money. And we're going to use that to describe how prices and inflation work. A couple of quick definitions. Price level. Right, we've talked about that, right? That's the CPI, the GDP deflator. We've gone through that already. The value of money. It is just the inverse of the price level. So this is the quantity of goods and services that can be bought with $1. This is what I really care about. I care about how far my money will go. I said, if I'm a trillionaire, but it only buys me a bus ticket, I'm not really that wealthy. Okay, when we talk about kind of wealth, what we really care about is how far does my value of money go? How much goods and services can I buy with my dollar? So if the price level goes up, the value of my money goes down, and that means I can't buy as many goods and services because businesses will want more dollars to compensate them for their goods and services. So the graph is a tad bit funky looking. Here's the typical graph we would expect. We would expect value of money, quantity of money, right? That's the typical XY graph. However, this one is a little funky in that what it has is this right side of the price level. And anything that's on the right side, it's so rarely used. I'm not a big fan of it, but it's what the book does, is anything on the right side goes opposite. So here is a high number, all the way up is a low number. So it works opposite the value of money. And it should, right? Because remember, they're inverses. Well, when I do a lot of the slides in the book, or if I draw graphs on my own, I focus on the value of money and the quantity of money. And you should just know from definition or from work in the book, the relationship between the value of money and the price level, right? That they're inverses. So if the value of money decreases, that means the price level increased. So let's talk about how we set up our supply and demand. Remember, as always, we have supply and demand. What's unique about our supply curve is it's going to be a vertical line. Why is it a vertical line? Because the Fed sets the money supply. When we spent in chapter 16 talking about the money supply, did we discuss anything about the value of money in relation to the Fed? The answer to that is no. The Fed just decides to set the money supply. It's not influenced by the value of money or the price level. There's no market mechanism going on. It's just the Fed saying, here's where we want the money supply to be. We set it. And then the price will respond to what we set the money supply at. So there is no real interaction here. The Fed just picks a number and it sets the money supply at that number. Now remember, it doesn't have complete control over that, but here we're going to assume it does. So they supply the number. However, there is money demanded. So as citizens, as businesses, as market participants, remember we use money to trade for goods and services. If my money starts to lose value, or the price level increases, I'm going to want more money because I want to buy goods and services. Or if I'm a business and your money you've given me isn't as valuable as it was before, I'm going to want more of it. So that's how money demanded responds to the value. So there's this inverse relationship, as there always is with demand, right? Quantity is inversely related to, it used to be price, but remember, it's not quite price here. It's the value of money. Now, in reality, it is the price of money, but if I say that, we confuse that with the price level. So that's why we use the term value. So it's how much my money is worth. So when I put them together, we come to an equilibrium. Just like we always have. Value of money, and then of course it gives us the price level. What I will go through and we'll talk about is I like to talk about moving the money supply curve. So if the Fed decides to increase the money supply, it moves right, as always. If they decide to decrease the money supply, it moves left. So what happens when they increase the money supply? As we should project, prices, the value of money decreases. And the value of money decreases. That means the price level increases. So this is kind of how the adjustment process works. So I'm not going to read the slide to you, but please look over the slide because you'll need to understand it for your homework. All right, so that's kind of the supply and demand mechanism that works to determine the value of money. Now, how we kind of relate money to a broader picture in the economy is something we call the quantity theory of money. So this is going to describe the relationship between money, prices, and GDP. So let's kind of start this discussion and go back and remember that there are two types of variables. There are nominal variables and there are real variables. Remember, nominal variables are measured in monetary units. So nominal variables can be changed by changing the inflation rate or changing how much money is worth. Real variables are measured in physical units. So when I talk about wages as an economist, I talk about real wages. When students talk about wages, usually you talk about nominal wages. And a lot of times people don't understand the difference, but there's a huge difference between nominal and real. And we'll talk about that here in a second. So here's an example, kind of the relative price. Okay. So if I went to the store and I see that the smartphone price is $450 and the pepperoni pizza is $10. So what's the relative price or kind of the real price of a smartphone? So a smartphone is really worth 45 pizzas. So if I'm getting a smartphone, what I'm willing to give up is 45 pizzas to get there. This is kind of reflected on the real price. That's in units, right? So one smartphone costs 45 pizzas. That's the real price. The nominal price is this 450. So as economists, what we think about does the price of smartphones go up? Well, that depends on how many pizzas it's worth. So let's talk about that in something we really care about. We don't really care a lot about prices of pizzas and smartphones. Most of the time, what we care about is how much money am I making? So we call it the real and the nominal wage. So this is where it really plays into effect. So if I'm getting $15 an hour, and the price level is 5, just to give us an example. How do I get my real wage? To get the real wage, all we do is we take the nominal and we divide it by the price level. So my real wage here is 3. So a lot of times, how do I know if my real wage goes up? So I work here at the university. And so let's say the chancellor came out and in 2019, she says, Dr. Walshide, you're such a great professor. I'm going to give you a raise of 2.3%. So in 2019, I got a raise of 2.3%. So did that affect my nominal or did that affect my real wage? Well, as I'm getting supposedly I got 2.3% more. However, what was the CPI in 2019? So inflation went up by 2.3% in 2019. So did my real wage actually go up? So no, I didn't actually get a raise in 2019. I just got inflation. Sometimes they refer to this as a COLA, as a cost of living adjustment. Because I actually wasn't really that good because I didn't get a real wage increase. Now, your boss will tell you this all the time. Oh, you're so great, so I'm going to give you a 2.3% raise. However, if inflation went up by that, that's not a real increase in your wages. That means you were as good as normal. That wasn't an increase in your wage. That was just meeting inflation. Or sometimes we refer to that as a cost of living adjustment. So I actually didn't really get a raise in 2019. I got a nominal raise, but my real wage didn't really change. I could still buy the same goods and services that I could before. So the answer to your question, Francisco, is yes. That's what we talk about when we talk about real prices. Is it's measured in another unit, correct? So that kind of gives us an idea about talking about real and nominal wages and kind of how we apply them. So let's talk a little more again about the theory, going back to classical dichotomy. Changes in money supply. So if the government decides to increase the money supply, that will only change the price level. And if I change the price level, I only change nominal variables. I never change real variables. So classical dichotomy is what we call a long run or a long term examination of the US economy. So if money changes, it affects only nominal variables, not real ones. This principle is actually referred to as money neutrality. That is the theory that money supply does not affect real variables, only nominal ones. So if I double the money supply, causes all nominal prices to double. What happens to relative prices? The answer to that is nothing. So here's the example. So here's how we would see the neutrality of money. So here's the real price, and here's the real price. So if central bank doubles the money supply, what happens to the real wage and total employment? The answer to that is nothing. No change. No change, no change. Real wage is the same. So if real wage doesn't change, labor supply and labor demand doesn't change. We're still at the same point we were before. And total employment doesn't change. However, my paycheck got bigger, but so did the cost of everything else. So in reality, I'm even. But this is where students or people don't understand. Because go back to my example. Why did I get a raise? Well, I got a raise because the chancellor told me I was great. It's that evil government that doubled my prices. So they're the ones that stuck it to me because I know my boss told me I was great. No, my boss really didn't tell me that. She said I was just as good as normal. But we don't see that as I see because my wages went up, I'm great. Prices went up because the government is sticking it to me. In reality, it's the same coin. Wages are prices. And so if prices go up of everything, I should expect my wage to go up as well. So let's kind of look at how these things come together. So how these things come together is something through the velocity of money. So what we're going to end up with the quantity theory of money is an equation that looks as such. M times V equals P times Y. So P, remember, is the price level. Y is always real GDP, what we talked about before. M will be the money supply. And V, this capital V, is something we call velocity. Now, what is velocity? Velocity is how fast money changes hands. So how fast is it when you get paid that you go out and you buy groceries? And the grocery store pays their employees, and those employees go out and buy more groceries, and it cycles through the economy. So how fast does money change hands? So if we look at this graph and we look at velocity, and what we notice about velocity is you should notice that it is relatively constant. So velocity has been relatively constant over time. It doesn't change a whole lot. And so because velocity doesn't change a whole lot, that means we would consider it a constant. So if we go back to our formula, M times V equals P times Y, and if velocity doesn't change, because remember it's going to be a constant, that means if I increase M, then P and Y, P and or Y must change. Because remember, it's an equation. So that's kind of why we talk about when we increase the money supply, it's going to lead to changes in either P or Y, because velocity doesn't change. So again, I know some of you don't pay a lot of attention to the news, and that's okay, because that's kind of what this is. But so most of you have, and they've talked about how the money supply, at least in the United States, has skyrocketed during the pandemic, right? We talked about the money supply has skyrocketed. But actually, we've seen little changes in P and Y, right? We haven't seen the price level skyrocket. We really haven't seen a huge change in GDP. The money supply has skyrocketed, so why haven't P and Y changed? Well, because what we've noticed with this pandemic and everyone being locked at their house is this is one of the few times velocity has fallen. So if we look at velocity over the past year, it has gone way down. And so if MS has gone way up and velocity goes way down, that means there's not necessarily this change in P or Y, because velocity changed. Now, why you hear this discussion about why we're worried about inflation is because when the economy opens back up, what should we expect to happen? Well, what should we expect to happen is we expect velocity to go back to where it's always been, to go back to this straight line. And if velocity goes back to the straight line, well, then we're going to know that either P or Y is going to have to increase. So under normal circumstances where V doesn't change, if we change M, then P or Y must change by the same percentage. So if we think about Y, and we remember we go back to chapter 10 and we talked about real GDP, right? Or we even talk about productivity. When we talk about productivity or Y, or real income, we talked about the 4 factors of productivity or what changes our income, right? We talked about natural resources, human capital, physical capital, or technological knowledge. Did we talk about money? Well, no, because money does not affect economic growth. It doesn't affect real income. So since money doesn't change real GDP, then I'm only left with one option, right? So if money increases, I know velocity is constant, so it can't change that. I know GDP isn't affected by the money supply. So that leaves us with only prices to increase. And so over time, what we expect to see when the money supply increases is we see the price level increases. And so that's what this graph kind of shows. Is if you look at this graph and you notice, for the most part, with the rare exception in the last couple of years, nominal GDP, P times Y, has almost been the same as the money supply. And that should be exactly what happens. Is that as we've grown as an economy, because remember, Y does change because we do get more productivity, that there shouldn't be this huge separation. And why we haven't seen the spike in inflation is we still have this gap here because velocity has fallen over the past couple of years. We don't know why. But because it's fallen, we've kind of separated our M and our P times Y, and that's why we see the separation. It's a new phenomenon pretty much from about 2010 onward. So there's a group of economists, and they used to be referred to as monetarists. Monetarists believe, well, it's not quite their belief, but we're going to go with the very simplest view. They believe the US government or the Federal Reserve should increase the money supply in the US by 2% every year and then go home. They believe their job should be super easy. That they should just increase the money supply by 2% and go home. Why 2%? Why 2%? Because that is the long run growth rate. Right? The US grows at about 2% a year. If I increase the money supply at 2% a year, right, that means prices will remain stable. Because I do have to take account GDP. So if GDP goes up, I have to keep money supply up by the same amount, or prices will fall. This is what actually happens in the 1880s. Is that we see a growth in the US economy, but the money supply doesn't change. And because the money supply doesn't change, prices actually fall. So that's why we see deflation in the 1880s, is because we don't have a change in the money supply. And we'll talk about why that occurs. So let's talk about what we call an inflation tax. Now there's a fancy term for it. Now I will misspell it, and that's why it's not going to be really legible, because I apologize, my spelling is horrible, it always has been. I was a horrible speller, thank goodness for spell check. But the fancy term for revenue the government raises by printing money is called seigniorage. We will just call it an inflation tax. So how a government raises money or revenue is always through taxation. So anytime the government wants to spend money, the only way they do that is through taxation. There is no other way around it. So they can print it, which is an inflation tax. They can borrow it, which means they just tax future generations. Or they can be honest and just tax the people today who are going to benefit from it. But governments don't want to be upfront, because if you raise people's taxes, they don't like you. So they like to do it through alternative ways. And one of the ways they like to do it is through an inflation tax. Thankfully, in the US, this has been a relatively small percentage of our budget, somewhere around 3%. So we haven't had this huge inflation tax. How does an inflation tax work? So if you are actually holding cash in your wallet, is the way to think about this. So as the US prints money, what happens to that $100 bill in your wallet? Well, as the government prints money to pay people, what happens to that $100 is it becomes less valuable. So what they're doing is they're really taxing your $100, because at the end you really only now have 97. It's now only worth $97. Why? Because they took that $3 and they allocated it somewhere else. Right? That's how they paid people. So they took your $3 and gave it to someone else. They don't literally do that. They just make your money worth less. So now your $100 only gets you $97 worth of goods and services, where before it used to get you $100. And so that's how they created an inflation tax. And how do I avoid an inflation tax? Is I hold assets. I don't hold money. So I hold things like gold, real estate. There's some discussion about whether holding Bitcoin will avoid the inflation tax. Those are kind of things that the government, when they change the price, my price will still go up, so I don't lose the money on the taxation. And so when you see periods of high inflation, you should see prices of goods and services go up. And I want to make sure I'm going up with those goods and services as well. But thankfully, in the US, it only accounts for 3% of total revenue. If you look in the book, it talks about history. You can see there's been hyperinflation. That's almost always why we see hyperinflation. Right? That's why we've seen it in Zimbabwe. We've seen it in Venezuela. You go back in history, it's Germany after World War I. We've seen this period of hyperinflation, and it comes about because governments print money. The Fisher effect, just a reminder that the real interest rate equals the nominal minus the inflation rate. Or we can rewrite it as the nominal rate equals the real interest rate plus the inflation rate. So just remember this formula. We've talked about it before. The fancy term for it is the Fisher effect. So I'm going to cover one more thing before we go today. Moved along pretty quickly. I apologize, but it's kind of hard. I said I don't get questions. It's hard to work with chat, so I just see the slides and I talk, and I apologize. But I try to go as slow as I can slow myself down. So let's talk about when we talk about inflation. So why economists view it differently than citizens is what we call the inflation fallacy. We've talked about it a little bit. Right? So the inflation fallacy is inflation robs people of purchasing power of his or her hard-earned dollars. So when prices rise, buyers pay more, sellers get more. Well, just a reminder that wages are part of selling. So as the price goes up, as a business, they get more money. When they get more money, usually they pay their employees more. So it doesn't really reduce our purchasing power. Because what happens is, as prices go up, the price of everything goes up, including wages. But the business doesn't tell you that you got a raise because that's just cost of living. That's just what we give people. You aren't more productive, but because inflation has occurred, people's wages go up. And some of them go up automatically, right? We talked about, remember that's what we talk about as a COLA. Because if you worked for the military or you've worked for places of unions, most of the time they have written in their COLAs. If you're a Social Security recipient, you have a COLA. So when the prices go up, your wages or what you get paid goes up. So you stay even. So your real wage doesn't change. What we talked about before, why it's a fallacy, is because my boss doesn't tell me it's a COLA. She tells me I'm great and excellent. So I think I'm more productive. That's why I'm getting paid more. In reality, it's just to meet inflation. And so if inflation doesn't change and my nominal wage doesn't change, I'm just as well off. However, a lot of times people don't understand that. So a lot of times we'll talk about how the government likes a little bit of inflation. So if my wages went up 2% and inflation went up 2%, remember my real is 0. If my wage didn't change and there was no change in inflation, my real wage is 0. However, as economists, we understand there's other disciplines in this world. And to an economist, it doesn't matter whether you're in world A or world B, they're exactly the same. What you can buy hasn't changed. However, we do find that people feel psychologically better. They feel happier when their paycheck goes up. Even though they can't buy more goods and services, they like to see bigger numbers on their paycheck. So what psychologists have found is that people would rather live in world A than world B. And as economists, we do pay attention to what other people think and say, well, the two worlds are equal and people would rather be in world A than B, then maybe there is a little reason to have a little bit of inflation because it moves people's wages up and they're happier. However, there is going to be a cost to inflation. And what we will talk about on Wednesday is the cost to inflation. And we'll go through the 5 costs of inflation, as well as we'll cover chapter 18. Now, there was a question from the homework, which I will cover because they asked. So what they talk about is something called inflation-induced tax distortions. So if you're working the homework, I believe it's question 8. I'm not remembering exactly the question, but it's question 8. And so what happens is you're given this investment product and you're given a nominal return. You're given the inflation rate and they ask you for the real return, as well as you're given a tax rate. So we're going to assume here I'm taxed at 10%. So my nominal return is I get 4%. Inflation is 2%. So if there's no taxes, my real return is very simple. 4 minus 2 tells me my real return is 2. Now, what about taxes? So what if the government taxes 10% of my gains? Well, when we talk about taxes, governments don't tax real rates. Don't ask me why they don't, but that's a story we'll talk about on Wednesday. They tax nominal returns. So if I get taxed 10% of my nominal returns, that means I get to keep 90% of my income. So I take 40% times 4% times 0.9 gets me 3.6. So what we call it our after-tax nominal return is 3.6. So it's 4 times 1 minus the tax rate. I subtract that from 2%. And then I find my real after-tax is 1.6%. So that's how you would do question 8 on the homework. Somebody sent me an email, and as I said, if you send me an email, I will get to it, even if I don't get to it in the discussion. I will try to make sure I cover it so you can work it on the homework. So if you work your homework early, I will always answer the question. I know it's due today, but part of the online experience is you have to learn some of this material on your own, and I can't go for 2 hours a day talking. Just not fair for anyone, and you don't want to listen to me that long anyways. So on Wednesday, we will finish up and we'll talk about the cost of inflation. It's the last couple of questions on your homework. So I got through probably 70% of your homework. The last part is what will be covered on Wednesday. Are there any questions before we go? All right, if there are no questions, then I will see you on Wednesday. Please remember to look through the slides when you are doing your homework.